So today we're looking at this little bit in Matthew about the commands. They say, what's the greatest command to Jesus? And Jesus says that these two things, love God and love your neighbour. So, and when you think about the long list of commandments, the 10 commandments, they come with a do or do not, and then a verb, something we might think about a verb. This is when my English is not as good as it should be. You know, do not murder, do not commit adultery, you know, all those sorts of things. So they have this kind of do or do not. But the summary of the law, where Jesus is summarizing what are the most important things to do, he just uses one verb. And that verb is to love. Love God and love your neighbour. And yet, if you ask people to define love, you will get all sorts of different answers. We find it difficult to define in English because we just have this one word, love. Other languages have more words for love, different ways of talking about it. But how do we think about it for us? Love God, love your neighbour. Last week, when I was preparing for today's service, I ended up lost for a few minutes in an imaginary 1980s pop quiz with the phrase "What's love?", which led me to Tina Turner. What's love got to do with it? And to probably a more age-specific one for me. What is Love Anyway by Howard Jones, which apparently was 1983. So some of the younger and older may not remember that. I was a big fan of Howard Jones. Jesus says this is what we should do: love God and love our neighbour. Will this love be just a feeling inside our hearts or brains, or will it be some sort of outworking of this love? Now, one of my friends is always trying to get me to read the 5 Love Languages book. She thinks I would find it really useful, and she's probably right. It's kind of a classic kind of book now. And you can look it up. The 5 languages of love it suggests are receiving gifts, affirming words, physical touch, acts of service, and quality time. And it suggests that humans express and receive love in their relationships in those ways. And I was thinking about that in the context of today's readings. These are ways which we love each other as humans. And are they useful for us to think about how we love God and how we love our neighbour? I think probably they are. If I asked you to say, how do you express your love for God? What would you say? Would it maybe fit into one of those categories above, you know, the quality time, the affirming words, the acts of service, those sorts of things? Then, how do we show our love for our neighbour? Again, you have these themes of gifts, words, touch, service, and time. They're all pertinent here. But I just want to say, as a caveat, don't touch your neighbour at the moment. It's not allowed. But all the others are things we can do. And actually, I think some of us are really feeling the pain of not being able to touch our neighbour. We had so many people in Cologne Church this morning, but when we came to sharing the peace, it was like, well, this is where normally we would greet each other, but don't. But that doesn't mean that these other things aren't important for us to think about our neighbours at the moment. Gifts, words, touch, service, and time. And then we get to the question, who is our neighbour? Now, some of you will remember that after this kind of, you have to love your neighbour, someone actually then goes on to ask, who is my neighbour? Now, if you're really clever and remember, you'll know what the response to that was. But you're all muted, so I'm not going to ask you to fill in. But the response to Jesus being asked, so Jesus, who is my neighbour? Jesus goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a story which is full of those characteristics of love towards the injured man. He picked him up, He dressed his wounds, he put him on the donkey, he gave up his time, and he paid the innkeeper to care for him. So I think when we were listening to Alice earlier on in the set of songs that we had about loving God and loving our neighbour, how we show that, we had a really good set of songs to help us think about what it means. I just want to finish by reading those two things that form the summary of the law. Again, we use them all the time in Book of Common Prayer. They're in every Book of Common Prayer communion service. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Amen.